Hello there GCSEers, and today we're going to explore the question, what is a sacrament? And we're going to do that looking at baptism this week, and next week we're going to look at a sacrament called Holy Communion, or the Eucharist. Now humans often give each other gifts at Christmas or birthdays, and I'm sure you lot have all received many gifts in your lifetime at various different times in your life. But some gifts mean much more than the physical aspects of what they are. I'm sure you've all received electronic gifts or gifts of clothing and things like that, but ultimately you'll grow out of the clothing, or the electronic items will break down and they'll mean nothing to you in 5-10 years time. But there's some gifts that people get that mean a great deal to them all their lives. For example, a few years ago my wife gave me a ring, and that ring was given to me on my wedding day, and if I lost that ring it would mean everything to me. Now the ring's only worth a few pounds, but the actual giving of it and what it means to me is far more important than that. It means the love that I share with my wife. Now most of the gifts that mean something to people express love, and that's far greater than the physical worth of the item. And Christians believe that sacraments are exactly the same. They're a gift given by God that means so much more than the actual event that actually happens. Now, a sacrament is what's known as an outward sign of an inward grace. The outward sign is the event itself. The baptism, and I'm sure many of you have been christened, for example, means more than the actual day that it actually happens. And the grace that's given is the gift from God, the love that God has, and it's expressed in that actual outward sign. So it's a gift from God that cannot be experienced through the senses, that people actually have once they've actually received that gift. Now most Protestant churches generally say there are two sacraments. Those are baptism and the Eucharist, or Holy Communion. And this is because these were seen in the New Testament as given by Jesus. Now some Protestant churches have confirmation as well, and that's if they practice something called infant baptism, and a few years later, when the person is old enough to make those commitments for themselves, they receive something called confirmation, where they renew their baptismal promises, where they can actually do it rather than their parents and godparents actually making those promises for them. So the sacrament of baptism, Eucharist and confirmation are often known as the sacraments of initiation, and many Christians across the world, most Christians, have those three sacraments, have at some point in time gone through those three sacraments. Now for Roman Catholics and Orthodox churches there are 7. They include things like marriage or taking on holy orders, and also a final one where people often receive the sacrament of the sick, or the sacrament of what's called final unction, which is actually the sacrament just before somebody dies. But we're going to be concentrating mostly on the sacraments of baptism and the sacraments of Holy Communion. Now you might recall from Unit 1 the story of Jesus' baptism, and you remember the voice from heaven representing the Father, and the dove representing the Spirit, and Jesus there being the Son, and the Trinity being involved. And that's important in baptism, so we're going to look at that in a few minutes' time. And basically the story is important because Jesus actually went through her baptism and it started his ministry on earth. And just as it began Jesus' ministry on earth, so it also begins Christian ministry, Christian people's ministry on earth. People believe it's the beginning of their Christian life. Now Jesus' baptism set an example for his believers to follow and begin their new lives in the Christian community with the power of the Holy Spirit. It involves the use of pouring water on a new Christian's head, or sometimes even total immersion within the water itself. And it's believed to cleanse original sin. Now remember what original sin is, the sin of Adam and Eve, and people becoming a new Christian. So, as we learned in Unit 1, after Jesus' resurrection and just before he ascended into heaven, he commands his disciples to do this: to go throughout the whole world and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And this still happens right across the world in 2 ways. The first way is infant baptism, and I'm sure that if you've been christened, that you will actually have been christened when you were a little baby. And you might want to ask your parents if you're not sure whether you have. Now some call this being baptized, and this would happen when you were, as I say, a little baby. Most Christians practice this, although some offer believers' baptism also. Here the priest or the vicar will use the words of Jesus, baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, whilst pouring water over the baby's head. And then parents and godparents make the promises to bring up the child as a Christian. Now it's important that the parents and the godparents make the promises, because obviously the little baby cannot make the promises. As well as water, the child is anointed with oil, which signifies strength, and it wears a white robe, which signifies new life and also the forgiveness of sins. And you can see here that it's very, very important for some Christian families that they begin the child's life right from the very beginning, that sign that they have been baptized will be part of their life forever. But it brings the question, why baptize babies? They haven't committed a sin. Well, Christians such as Catholics and Anglicans believe that all humans share in that original sin. You remember that original sin, turning away from God, that we learn about in the story of Adam and Eve. And baptism forgives this. Babies are welcomed into the Christian community as soon as possible, and many Christians believe that's vitally important. The second form of baptism is something called believers' baptism. And some Christians, for example Baptist and Pentecostal churches, believe that a baby is too young to understand what baptism means, and only an adult can make that full decision. And they believe that baptism doesn't save a person from sin, but begins their journey in life. And it often involves total immersion in a pool. Now, some churches, the Baptist church in Droitwich, for example, have a pool at the back of the church that they can bring the altar forward, and there's a pool there, and it's very small, but basically that's involved in people actually coming down and receiving total immersion. They're baptized, their complete body goes under the water. And then people often give a testimony saying why they want to be a Christian. Now, we're going to look briefly at the arguments for and against both infant baptism and believers' baptism. So, why do some people think that infant baptism is a good idea? Now, the key thing is that it's natural for Christian parents to want to bring their child up as a practicing Christian right from the very beginning. And the child will receive the gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are essentially the things that they receive at baptism, and this enables them, they believe, to spiritually grow and to bring Jesus into their lives. And it enables the child to receive the other sacraments. As we saw, Roman Catholics and Orthodox Church believe there are 7 sacraments, and those follow an order. So infant baptism is the first one and begins them on their journey. And the key one, I suppose, is often if an unborn baby is unlikely to survive, then the parents will know that they have become part of the Christian family before the baby is unfortunately lost. Now, why do other Christians support believers' baptism? And the main reason, as we've looked at, is that only those old enough really to know what they're doing and being fully committed to the decision should be baptized. It's a big decision, and an individual should make it for themselves and not rely on their parents. So they'll often make it at around 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and even older than that, to be able to say, yes, this is what I want. Jesus himself was baptized as an adult, as we've seen, as were most people in the early church. When they are older, children might resent the promises made on their behalf when they were babies. They may not like the fact that somebody else made promises for them. The idea of cleansing sin doesn't make sense for a baby, as we've seen. Now, if you believe that everybody's born with original sin, then that's something that the Roman Catholic Church and Anglican Church and other churches believe, but obviously a baby hasn't committed any sins. And for many people, infant baptism is just a meaningless practice that just names a child. Many people just go through with it because that's what their family's always done, and they do it for the benefit of the grandparents or whatever. And is it really worth it for that? Many of those who've been baptized don't go to church again, except if they decide to get married. And that, I suppose, is one of the big ones. It's a big one because it's just seen as a small little service to get the baby through, almost like a naming ceremony that basically is meaningless because people don't go to church again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's what a sacrament is, and also infant baptism and believers' baptism. Make sure you've written down the arguments for infant baptism as well as the arguments for believers' baptism. You may have to make an argument for both in your exam.